Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin here with my co-host Teos Abadia. Hey Teos, welcome to the real meat of 2023. We've gotten through the appetizers. We are now here at the main course. We are in it for good now. There's
Wow,
no escape.
that's fantastic. Well, I'll say I'm excited for this all vegan diet that's going to come. So
I don't think that's going to be the case, at least in this neck of the woods. But that's okay too. We have enough meaty news and listener feedback that we're actually going to spend the whole episode just doing news and feedback.
yeah,
Uh, and we're going to get into other stuff. So here's the plan going forward. Let me know how this sounds, Taz.
I'm
Next
listening.
week, next week or this coming weekend is Winter Fantasy, where you and I will both be attending.
Exciting.
Correct?
I'm looking forward to it.
So I have a feeling we should record there and
Okay.
maybe talk to some of the people who are big in the organized play arena. Maybe Dave Christ, maybe uh, Greg Marks, maybe Claire Hoffman, folks like that who are actually because we did get a question. Someone wanted us to talk about organized play, so that would be a great time to
Oh
do
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Make that a one episode show. Then when we get back to the real juicy vegan part of our calendar, we will dig into other role playing games since that's what won our poll.
Excellent. Well, that also works well because there are a number of sort of other games that are running at Winter Fantasy this year, which I'm excited about. Both
True
D and
story.
D non AL, and then which you're running some of,
Mhm.
and then there are some non D and D games. There's some aliens. There's some other really fun stuff there that looks cool. So yeah, I like that plan. So
Okay.
today's show, all news, all the time, which is great because boy, there's a metric ton of it.
Yeah, and we've been skipping out on pieces because of the open gaming license stuff. So we've had to push off a lot of news that we are going to get to today. We're going to get through all of it, as well as some great comments and questions from our listeners, and then go into next week with the plan of news and analysis as we normally do. So,
Fantabulous.
yes, sir. So, with that stated, let's get to our first listener who comes in via Patreon. This is Nick Drocek. I've spoken before about playing a lot of different tables, or I'm sorry, you've spoken before about playing a lot of different tables as a DM to get better. I'd love to hear more about what you've learned, maybe frame it as a level 1 to 20 DM class. What class features should we, as DMs growing our craft, think to add to our character sheet? And
Mm.
that's a really good question and a really interesting way to frame it. So, what do you think, Teos? What are some of your
Oof,
thoughts for Nick here?
so much, and yeah, I mean, I think it is like one of the kind of biggest tips. If anyone were to say like, what should I do to like acquire skills and learn and this kind of stuff, I would say go run tons of games at conventions, right? Because you learn so much by going from one table to another. Like when you're running your table, you know your group and you get to learn them and their ways and what pleases them. And when you are at a convention, especially running the same adventure over and over again, you run table A, table B, table C, and one of them has a great time, one of them has an okay time, one of them has a bad time, and you can reflect on all that and think about, was it something I did? Is it that the adventure doesn't resonate in a particular way? And the more you do that, you get to really see what is it in adventure design that sort of pleases lots of people, pleases a few kind of niche people, and you learn approaches around all this because you are exposed to all these different types of interests and kind of ways that people will play. And you and I have talked about in the past about player types, right? Actor, explorer, instigator, power gamer, slayer, storyteller, thinker, watcher. And that's one of those things where this comes into play because when you're running for so many different people, you kind of learn to identify what different players look like, what they want, right? And so you're like, you start the game and very quickly you're like, oh, okay, that person, this kind of experience will really work for them. And this person really needs this kind of experience. And so you develop these good techniques. Just some other stuff, Sean, and I'll shut up, is pacing because you have to run things in a timetable. So when you're running lots of tables, it tends to be a store or a convention. and you learn how to stay on track, finish on time, how to handle the combat that's running long, how to keep that pacing flowing. Things like character and scene introductions so that they get you started really fast on a good footing. Um, yeah, so I think that, and all these things are helpful when you go back and you run just for your one table, but they are things that especially are helpful when you are designing for many tables, or if you're going to DM at conventions or stores, of course.
Yeah. And I agree with everything Teos said. To take his analysis and go in a different direction, for me, DMing, the closest thing I can compare it to is teaching, with the DM being the instructor and the players being the students. And obviously, there are many differences between those two things, but there are also many similarities that I've noticed. Now, I was educated as a teacher, but I have not been a full-time teacher. I teach occasionally, so I do not want to come off like I think I'm a master teacher. That's my wife. And we talk about education a lot. And so if we're going to go to the class, right, your class features, your DM level 1, I think of that as also a teacher level 1. So a level 1 teacher generally knows the content that they're going to teach, but it's a matter of delivering it in a way that your students will be able to best understand it, to make it
Mhm.
interesting, to make complex ideas simple to grasp at first, to let the student take your example and learn themselves from that, right? All of those things are important to teaching. So, in teaching, you have many different kinds of students, and each student is going to have a different interest, a different ability level, all of that. When you're a DM, you're going to have many different kinds of players, from very experienced who want mechanics to very inexperienced. You may have experienced that want storytelling but not mechanics. You may have inexperienced but wants heavy mechanics. How do you meld all of those things in the same class at the same table? There are many different methods to teach the same material. There are many different play styles that handle the gameplay of the same adventure. Um, Teaching isn't just spouting out information, right? It's managing expectations, it's leading exploration, it's teaching skills as well as information. Well, DMing just isn't about spouting stories or rules, it's about leading the exploration of the story and the rules. Teaching is understanding and using multiple tools to get the information across. DMing is using multiple tools, grids, minis, roll 20, uh, or just a piece of paper to get that same experience. Communication is as important as the content in teaching, especially when it comes to keeping the student's attention and picking up on nonverbal clues from your students.
Mm.
Communication is as important as the content for DMs, especially when it comes to keeping your audience's attention and picking up on nonverbal cues, right? All of these things are about communication, teaching,
Yeah.
and uh and DMing. And so all of it comes together in a very neatly segmented and similar way.
Hmm.
So as you level up as a DM, for me, you are learning, obviously you're still learning about the rules, but generally you go in knowing enough about the rules to run the table. It's about that table management.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing, and that's what Teos already told us about, is managing the table based on just table after table and year after year and adventure after adventure of experience where you get to see it all play out right in front of your very eyes.
And yeah, that's fantastic. And it's interesting how great DMs that I see at conventions over and over again, I know that when I sit at that table, I'll have a great time. And it is
Mhm.
irregardless of how good the adventure is, right?
Right.
An okay DM will say something like, "Well, this adventure isn't that great," which is a bad thing to say, and they'll
Right.
deliver an okay experience, right? But it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
and the really great DMs play off of everything you do and reward and
Mhm.
heighten everything that the players are doing. And when you play at that kind of a table, it's
Mhm.
another kind of experience, right? Like where you just sense that difference of how they're taking care of you, how they are feeding off of what you're doing. And it is management, right? It is, you can just see them spinning all the
Right.
things, the adventure, the plots, what your players are doing. they're making notes of what you want, right, to experience and giving you more of that. And that's just great. That's the best.
Yep. Yep, and everything you just said goes to teaching as well, right? If you walk in and as a teacher and say, "Well, this is really hard. You guys are gonna have a hard time with this." Already the students are gonna be, sitting back on their heels. Whereas if you walk in enthusiastic and say, "This lesson, you're not gonna believe how much fun we're gonna have and what you're gonna learn," and you go in that way, everyone, their expectations are heightened, and they're more receptive to your learning,
Yeah.
and the teacher's always making sure that they're making eye contact with the different students and calling on different students and not not going or right,
Hmm.
using these repetitive phrases that students will then start writing down how many times the teacher went or okay or something like that. Same thing with
Yeah.
players. Uh, they're going to pick up on those verbal ticks, and so it's an amazing experience to
And
do,
there was a
and we could have an whole episode about
Yeah,
this.
there was a comment that was left on our YouTube this last week that was pretty fun, where it said about how their DM had run a classic D&D adventure for them, and then they looked at it and been like, "Wait, this wasn't kind of that was they threw all this extra stuff in, right?" And that's one of those things that we can get so married to the written word that we fail to see what actually the players need, right? And it especially happens if you wrote it, where you're trying to I've had the experience where I'm trying to remember what I wrote and how, and I'm like, why? It's not like it's some perfect thing on the paper, right? Like just go with what the moment calls for, right? Describe the scene the way you want to describe it, and it'll be, that's more important than whatever was
Mhm.
actually written down, right?
And that can be just as valuable as running lots of different players and lots of different tables, and that's run different things at those different tables. As
Yeah.
Teos said, try to run a short published adventure and stick as close as possible. Then try to run a short published adventure, but do anything you want.
Yeah.
And then just go in with a one page of notes and make the rest up and see how that goes. And all of those experiences will teach you through your players' reactions how well you're doing and how much of those reactions are to you versus just what the player likes.
Absolutely, right?
Whew, so
Good one.
that was a great question. So thank you so much for that, Nick. We will now move on to MD Black Rabbit via Mastodon. This is a long one, so hang in there. Do you all think do you all think for the TTRPG industry, the controversy over the open gaming license has a parallel in the controversy the music industry had resolved in the late 90s, early aughts with digital content and peer-to-peer sharing with Napster and similar sites? I'm going to skip the next part, but it talks about what that controversy was. Uh, it marked a major shift in how the public was exposed and consumed music. I was wondering if you both felt the TTRPG was in a similar space with the open gaming license controversy, particularly with more and more folks participating through virtual tabletops. Teos, take it away.
Well, I was in a metal band in high school as required by law, and I worked gigs large and small in the music industry. I had a lot of fun. I pretended to be a roadie many times. I love the music industry, and I do see that there are a number of parallels, though they are also very different industries. And while I see, what the question is getting at, um, and there are these huge changes in both the music industry and in the RPG industry about platforms and contracts. Um, and you can see how music at times had a very clear way that it operated, right? So it was like, hey, you've got these radio stations that are playing pop music, and that is driven totally by the engine of producers that are driving growth. And then something happens and the ecosystem is upset and it changes. Music contracts are vile. The OGL, however, is a little different, right? It's not a platform, and it's more of an incentive that has brought a lot of people towards writing for one of the games. But what you do with it is totally up to you, and that's where you get into the downside of the RPG industry, which is that it's brutal. Even though there's no, the contract is fine, there's nothing terrible about it. the RPG industry itself is one where, however you choose to sell that, it's really hard to get attention. There is no radio station out there. Um, Maybe hitching your horse to D&D helped somewhat, but not entirely. You can be on the DM's Guild and be buried. There are a lot of factors that are hard to measure as to why you're going to achieve success in the RPG industry. Something that is a parallel is that the smartest musicians that you look at are those who have streamlined operations for those activities. Like, go check up on what Bon Jovi did to reinvent touring. The smartest musicians
Mhm.
run that efficiently. They save and reinvest. You can look at David Bowie and what he did with investments from his music industry, and nobody would have thought David Bowie would have been the kind of person to do it, but he did. Um, and the same thing is true in RPGs. Talented people, there are lots of them, but some of the talented people make no money, and some of them find ways to create a really strong business. They are making smart move after smart move. Everything they do feels like it's being reinvested and leads to growth. And so that is something that I think is an interesting parallel on platforms and changes the way that, say, Spotify has commoditized music and really is kind of destroying it and shrinking it. We haven't had that parallel yet, right? But it could happen, right? There could be a situation where platforms, rather than highlight us, would shrink things further. And I think I'll probably add to the show notes a very interesting article that talks about how tech platforms are doing this, where they start with being really popular, really attractive, and whether it's a Facebook or a Twitter or whatever, then they start to put in all these terrible features to try to enrich in themselves and big in and they lock you into that platform and basically destroy everything that they once built. And it's a fascinating thing there. And I think that is a possible parallel that we have to always look at, because the art and creativity of music just at a general level can't sustain you the way it once could.
Mhm. And everything Teo said, yes. Uh, and the people who consume music are very different than the people who consume role-playing games, because role-playing games is not a passive thing. Now, music doesn't have to be a passive thing, but for the most part, you don't listen to a song because you are drumming out the part. You generally listen to the song and that's what you do. It's either in the background or you're actively listening, but you're not doing anything else. A role-playing game is a much different medium, and it involves people who are taking it and doing something with that role-playing game actively. That makes it very different, as we just found out with the DM's Guild, uh, and not DM's Guild, D&D Beyond, where people were upset about things that were going on and they canceled their subscription and it moved a needle.
Yeah.
People, the same number of people leaving Spotify would not move a needle, would not change the music industry. Uh, but it did in this case,
Mhm.
because the consumers of role-playing games are different. And I think Wizards not Wizards, really, Hasbro underestimated how different a medium it is and how different the audience is. So, as Teo said, we could see something similar going on in the future, but I think the customer base, the audience base for role playing games as players, not as brand enthusiasts, but as players, can move the needle in protest much easier than in other areas. So, moving on, we have Jorf Dan via Mastodon. Do you believe movements like the OSR, the old school Renaissance, are too fractured? Will the new OGL keep D&D as a base, or will we end up with dozens of games that more or less accomplish the same thing? So when Jorf Dan asks about the OSR, he's talking about the old school Renaissance games, which are essentially using older versions of D&D to create a rule set that does the things that old versions of D&D did, or sometimes trying to update them to use the old rules but offer a new play experience. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of such games out there. Hence the question, are they too fractured? So I think the question involves two issues: the games and the businesses. I don't think the games themselves are too fractured, even though there are hundreds, if not thousands, because there may be an audience for the particular thing that you did with your game. Business wise, I would say that it is too fractured to become a major business, because if you're trying to build a thriving publishing company on games that are very much clones of each other, then there isn't a way to really, you can maybe support one person and probably not even full-time one person. Uh, not to mention 20, 30, 40, 100 people uh, as that. So is it too fractured? Not if you like games like that and want to play a bunch of different games. Is it too fractured to hang a business on? Yes.
Mm. Yeah, agreed. OSR is trying to recreate nostalgia, and it's nostalgia for older editions that often people played in vastly different ways. And you can read all the historical accounts of, how there was, West Coast scenes that played it entirely differently than it was played in the middle of the country where it was created, right? And just within a span of a couple of years. And so many people will tell you that when they started with a game like Basic or AD&D, they would play a certain way and then meet another group, and the group would be like, "We don't do it that way. That's not what that rule says." And you'd think about it, and maybe both end up playing differently at the end of it. And so when we're trying to recreate that kind of nostalgia, we're going to inevitably end up with some real differences because the game was so wide open to interpretation. Now, third edition on, you really end up with games that are pretty standardized, right? They have a clear way that they explain what the rules are trying to do and what the game's trying to do. So we know what the game is trying to do. And even if we go back to recreate nostalgia for, say, 3E or 4E, the game is what it is. It's pretty obvious. And it was generally a thing to most people, right? We could choose our own personal preference, but the game is what the game is. And so when you create for 5e, that's the truth as well. But you may want the game to be different. And that's where now you may create a variance. It's a little different than the OSR, that if people say, I want to make D&D different, maybe because of the news that just finished happening, maybe just for your own reasons, that's fine. And as you said, Shawn, the game supports that. And I'm sure you can find some players that may love it and sing about it, sing its praises very loudly. But can you get the audience that will play it and drive good sales and make you a good company that can pay yourself, employees, and so on? That's hard, right? And the more that you choose to make a variant, the more that you're splintering away from the people who are going to want it. And that's true of any kind of tack. If you say, my world is one where there are no clerics, well, everybody who loves clerics is going to say, well, that's not the game for me. And any decision like that, you're splintering off. And the more of those that are splinters, I don't think it hurts D&D much. So many people are learning D&D by just walking into a gaming store and picking something off the shelf. And so I don't think it really impacts it at that level. It's more that the company's trying to live off of that, then that's a tall order.
Kurt Ugel from YouTube. I'm interested in the products that you two have worked on and what you learned from the process, both in business, mechanics, layout, storytelling aids, etc. I'm also interested in what you two have run, how your personal player GM styles evolved over time, and how your critical eye affects gameplay. Okay, so this is a really, really big question.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say, I'm going to try to get to the gist of the question for me. What I learned about role-playing games through active work in the industry and play, it led me to ask a couple questions when I'm working on a product or a game, or I'm sitting down to learn about a product or a game. There's basically three questions. One, what is your product and game meant to do? What is the experience it is supposed to invoke in me? Two, how exactly does it do that thing that you say it is meant to do? Right.
Mm.
You say this is supposed to be a fast, fun-paced storytelling game. Okay, good. when I read the rules, it's a fun, fast-paced storytelling game.
Mhm.
And how do the rules do that? So then I go to, if you lie to me in the first question, you say this is a fast-paced storytelling game, and I start reading it, and it is a mechanic heavy, very slow-paced game that really doesn't even tell a story, then you lied to me and you're in trouble. Now, if I read the rules and I realize you lied to yourself, that this is supposed to be that, but the rules do not uh, make that happen, then you're also in trouble because I'm not going to engage with the product as much as I would otherwise. And when I design games, that is how I go about it. Why are we making this product, this new game, this supplement? What is it meant to do? What experience is it supposed to invoke? And then everything I do, whether I'm writing it or editing it or the lead designer, so I'm overseeing people, it's always going back to that question. How does this doing what we said it was going to do? Is it doing what it said it was going to do? When we play test it, does it do these things? Then we know whether we've got a product that we're ready to go forward with.
Yeah. That's great, Sean. And that makes me think of something that's really important to me and that I think I've learned a lot from all the different projects that I've worked on, which is that when I create things for home, right, for my own personal use, and especially when I was younger, before I even thought about being a part of the industry, I was doing my things that I liked and was passionate about, and I just assumed everybody would like. You know, I like this movie, this TV series. I'm going to do that kind of thing here. Players, you better enjoy it because that's what you're getting, right? And when you work for other people, they will say to you, I want this, write this. And well, that's what you've got to do, right? And so being hired to do a thing like that where it's isn't necessarily what you would have created to begin with, but then you find how to make it interesting for you, sure. But more importantly, is to think to separate yourself from the work and to say, this is what that company wants. And this is what the audience wants. Hopefully it's their audience. That's all. The audience is their audience. But what do they want? What should this thing be? Which gets to those questions that you're saying, Sean, right? It really is that should all work, right? And so I've talked about things like with Dwarven Forge, where I mean, Dwarven Forge is a miniature terrain company. So when I am creating, we're about to launch a cool Kickstarter. When I'm creating an adventure for them, I think about their perspective as a terrain company. Like the terrain needs to matter in this adventure, right? And the people who are buying it are people who have purchased the terrain. So the terrain needs to be awesome because they've made an awesome purchase. And so those things, being able to step out of your own skin and see what the audience wants is super critical. Um, and I think that, I mean, this is a huge question because as you are creating in a lot of different projects, as the list of projects grows on, you have more and more experiences and you pick up more and more skills, right? Things like working with others or project management, team management, um, deadlines, right? Just all these kinds of things. And they can be far ranging. Like, I mean, I've learned in the last few years podcasting, streaming, which started with me asking my son how to use OBS, video editing, sound, and then there's layout, font choices, color combinations. I mean, all kinds of skills that I'm just barely scratching the surface of and trying to figure out how to do properly. And all of these learnings leak into your larger life, right? I've created character generators in Excel that are the reason I was able to do a really good job on a project because I was able to use an Excel tool to do it, right? And I can't tell the client, well, I learned that making a Legend of the Five Rings character generator. Collectible card databases taught me how to use MS Access, right? I mean, all kinds of things like that. And so all these things aren't going to come your way. And the key, I think, is making the voyage like super fun and enriching over time because then you keep enjoying evolving your style, changing up how you approach things. But at the end of it, the biggest influences for me, Sean, are the people that I meet, the products they create, how they run tables, how they play a character. Those are the things that probably resonate the most over the years. And it's led to big evolutions for me in how I approach the game, how I approach story, how I approach adventure writing, campaigns, all of that. And in the industry, right? People who I've seen do great things. What resonates to me the most are those people who teach others what they're learning and share their experiences and help others rise. And so that's been a huge influence for me as well, as I know it's been for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both came into the industry through organized play. And so going back to the first question we answered, right? We learned about the game through that avenue first. We
Mhm.
learned about creating something and then watching 100 people running the thing you wrote and the terror of that, but also the educational value of that and how important game masters are to the process. So you want to speak to the game master when you're creating your adventure. And for the first organized play adventures that we created, it was text only. There was no art. There was some editing, but not
Right.
a super amount of editing. No sort of layout control. It was basically a Word document. So we had to learn to communicate all of that with maybe a rough drawn handout as the most
Yeah.
exquisite piece of nonverbal communication we could have. When I started working for Wizards directly, I started learning more about the production of things. Oh, we can put minis in a box. We can put cardboard cutouts. What? Oh, we can make poster maps.
Yeah.
Then I
Please
started
fill
working
out the
for
art
Ghostwriter
order, right?
Gaming, where we have a full yeah, where we have a full production team. So now, from the very moment I'm sitting down and concepting something, I'm thinking about minis. I'm thinking about all of the things that we could possibly do with, say, an upcoming Kickstarter that'll launch in about 2 weeks called Valken Clans. Check it out on Kickstarter. Uh, right from the start, we're thinking about how we can enhance play experience in those ways. So you do learn those things. But I know for me and probably for Teos too, it always comes back to, what we learned as DMs and players. That's where the experience starts and ends for a lot of folks. So we want to make sure we get that right from the start.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is interesting about the production process. Like, I was working on a project recently involving monsters, and we had a meeting involving artists. And you can see how something like monster design can be done in a complete silo, right? Like, hey, make me, I don't know, a giant war ogre. And then someone else can say, we're going to have adventures that use these war ogres. Here are the kind of things they need to do. Here's the lore of the world and how war ogres fit into it. Here are the kinds of considerations the artists would like to work with, right? Let's weave that all together so that the war ogre stat block and history and write up and everything fit into all of these things that we're doing. And the more you can do that, the better that the whole product line is going to be, right? And but on the other hand, you and
Mhm.
I have both had experiences, even for really big companies, where they tell you, I need you to write this thing. And halfway through, they say, oh, yeah, this isn't that kind of product. Or where this adventure is going to premiere is totally different than you thought it was. Or actually, this feeds off of a thing that we're currently making. We haven't shared the draft with you, so you didn't know that. And just complete
Mhm.
curveballs, and it really impedes your ability
Yeah.
to create a good work because you haven't been brought into that process,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I've worked on a couple projects for Wizards where I wrote adventures based on some novels that they had put out. And I was so excited when I actually got a copy of the novel before I started writing the adventure because I could actually know what was happening. So that shows how sometimes, certain organizations or certain groups within organizations just don't have either the resources to do it the way it needs to be done or the foresight or any of those things. But when you talk about a full product, you're talking about, at least a year or more of work with many more people involved than just game designers. So
Absolutely.
it's it's much harder, but it's much better. It's a much better product for the DMs and players and consumers when you are able to do it right.